Dr. Kristine Harper. I'm so glad I found you in my Google search because you're the exact person I want to talk to about this. You are a scientist, you are a historian, and I want to go back to the very beginning of meteorology, way back to Aristotle. Can you tell me about the roots of meteorology and how the science began?
Well, of course, at the time of Aristotle, meteorology was a sort of an all-term catch-all for earth science. So Aristotle was not a person who did experiments, but he was a person who observed. And of course, if you're looking at ships that are sailing, which they were certainly around Athens on the water, then winds become important, for instance, right? So there was considerable interest in how the atmosphere worked and what that meant for being able to grow crops or sail vessels or those kinds of things. So you do see that early interest in what was going on around in the atmosphere, but it certainly wasn't a situation where people were making daily or hourly recordings and had any kind of scales to work with. So it was very qualitative work that was being done.
And he came up with the term meteorology?
Right. Well, because it was, and then like I said, it wasn't just focused on the atmosphere at that point. I mean, it included earthquakes and volcanoes and everything else that was kind of earth sciencey at the time.
And did it have any sort of spiritual relevance as well?
I wouldn't say that it did for Aristotle. I would say certainly that earlier on, at the time of the Babylonians, atmospheric phenomenon, thunderstorms and severe weather would have, because people were living out in it, right? And so if you're living in a situation where you're very much affected by the weather around you, then you get tuned in to looking for signs in the sky, and the weather was really tied to astronomy, if you want to look at it that way. I mean, not to the technical parts of astronomy, but where the stars were in the sky at night and where the sun was rising and setting, and connecting those events to what the typical weather was at the time for seasons, and therefore knowing when to plant crops and when it was going to be time to harvest them.
Right. I did an interview not so long ago about the Egyptian tomb, and that lines up to the winter solstice. I found that fascinating. That's really old.
That is really old, and you see that in other places around the world. Okay, so there's also a place in Ireland. Of course, we're later in time now, of course, from the Egyptians, but it is the same thing. It's this big earthen works, and if you climb in and you don't want to be a person who doesn't like enclosed spaces, all right, because it's really tight in there, but you can go inside, and then when it is the solstice, the sun goes directly into this slot. So I mean, it was built that way for a reason, so the sun came right through. I thought it was very, very cool. One other person who was on the tour was claustrophobic and had to get out of there very, very quickly. But it was cool to see.
Wow. So take me forward in time a little bit here. How did meteorology evolve from that point?
Well, it didn't evolve really fast. Let's put it that way. So we don't see the ability to take measurements of any kind until much later. So we have Galileo's thermometer, which basically worked by having different glass balls with different kinds of substances in them that would float up and down depending on what the temperature was. You can still buy those today. They're a higher class than the one that Galileo had. And then later on, in the 17th century, we're seeing originally mercury thermometers being developed, and later on we see alcohol thermometers being developed. But still, you have to have a scale And so we see later on the development of scales that are used so that people can take actual measurements, things like anemometers for doing wind speed. That really doesn't come up until the 19th century, and those were kind of shaky for a while. We don't have good aneroid barometers until later in the 19th century. And so it takes several centuries before we have the equipment to be able to do quantitative measurements. But earlier than that, in the time of Francis Bacon, for instance, he's encouraging people to make note of the kinds of weather events that they see. And so you have people in diaries recording, we had rain, it was windy, it was blowing from this direction, it was a cloudy day, it was an okay day. Many of them were farmers, and it was really important for them to keep track of what the weather was and then what they did with that. And so over time, we have more physics that's involved, but we don't really see physics involved in meteorology on a scientific level until early part of the 20th century.
Yeah, so I'm guessing technology really fast forwarded things, correct?
Well, it did, but it was still difficult to get upper level measurements, right? So you had surface observations. It was relatively easy to do surface observations. But until we had good balloons, initially balloons and then kites, and we had equipment that didn't freeze up once it got to upper levels, right? So, I mean, the first experiments that were looking at taking measurements at the upper levels, they went up in balloons, and the fluid that they were using in the thermometers froze. Right, because it was so cold, and that wasn't really helpful for figuring out what the temperature was. So at first you see people in balloons, literally in manned space flights, and then you see the use of kites, and then of course once aircraft were available, then people were going up in aircraft. But again, we're not talking about enclosed cockpits, so people were getting pretty chilly going up there, and we didn't have really good ways to do that, not until like the 1930s when we see the development of the first radiosondes. Okay, so packets of instruments that could go up with a large balloon and then go up much further than people had gone up before.
And then the invention of satellites completely changed things.
Completely changed things in the late 1950s. And at that point, we're really looking at pictures being taken. And those first pictures were not all of that good, right? Let's face it, they were grainy. It's not like you're taking a picture and then you can see the little lines on the earth between the countries on the continents, right? I mean, that all had to be overlaid, and they would take multiple little pictures and they would put them together as mosaics. And even by the early 70s, when I first got into the meteorology business, we only had 2 satellite pictures a day. They were from polar orbiters. And if the background couldn't be overlaid properly, we didn't have anything. I mean, we had something that sort of looked like an X-ray with shadow parts and dark parts, and we had no idea where it was. We didn't know, like there was nothing there. It was just like, well, we got this satellite picture, but
where is this hurricane?
Where is it? We have no idea where it is. So it was really hard to make use of that. It took a long time for satellite pictures to be so good that you could use them for something. And it took a lot of time to get people to buy into using them, because you can't use something that's not good. I mean, today we can get on the internet, and anytime we can get a full disc, we can get GOES, we can have them automatically loop so that we can see things going across the screen. They're clear, they're crisp. The background is there, everything's there. Maybe you can overlay it with radar. We didn't have anything that was close to that early on. Not even in the early 70s did we have that.
So you've seen a lot of advancement in your time
A
since the
huge
70s.
amount of
40 to
advancement,
50
yes.
years. That's a lot of advancement. What's been the most impressive and surprising advancement to you?
I think there have been a couple of things. I think the improvements in weather radar have been huge. So the first time I was able to use Doppler weather radar was starting in 1992, and I was stationed at the NATO base in Iceland at Keflavik. And we had Doppler weather radar, and I thought I died and gone to heaven. I mean, the weather can be really dicey in Iceland, and we have planes that are trying to leave and planes that were trying to come in, and it was just great being able to see these little cells coming towards us and being able to say to pilots, you have 15 minutes to get out of here, or you're not going anywhere for a while. So make your decision about what you want to do. So the improvements in weather radar have been tremendous. And on satellites, it's not only the pictures, but it's all of the sensors that are on the satellites now, so that you can track rain rates, you can track sea surface temperature, you can track sea heights, right? All of those sensors that are being hung around on the satellites now give us information for parts of the earth where we don't have people standing there saying, yep, I'm going to go out and take my observation now. Because there aren't any people to do that. And so you just, you can't overstate the importance of satellites for bringing in all that data. And then the improvement of models, forecasting models, and the size of computers that can process all of that data. Those things together have made a huge difference in how we're able to forecast the weather.
With all of those advancements and everything that can be done inside, is there still something to be learned from history and walking outside and looking at clouds and taking note of what you feel and see?
I still think having a feel for the weather is really important. Over time, in some sectors, we've seen a pulling back to big centers that are forecasting for places far away, because they're saying, well, we're not there, but like we've got all the information. And there's nothing like being there, right? Because what shows up on your weather map and what shows up on the satellite is still not the same as being able to walk out the door or look out the window and say, okay, well, I know what the model says, but that's not what I'm seeing out there right now. And that's where the problem comes in. Once you've lived someplace for a while, you have a much better sense of what the weather patterns are, how the atmosphere behaves in that particular area, what the little microclimate issues are for what's going on there. It still makes a big difference. So personally, I really like being on site because it makes a difference how you interpret what you see once you've lived someplace for a while.
So you're saying local meteorologists are important. That's great to hear.
Super important as far as I'm concerned. Yes.
All right. Well, let's talk about the future of meteorology. What do you see for the future? What are you excited about for the future?
I think we'll see more incorporation of kind of citizen science data, right? Where there will be sensors on everything. And so particularly on people's cell phones. And I realize there are real privacy issues here. But just like cell phone data is used to determine when there are traffic jams on roads, I think there will be the possibility of using that same information, maybe telling us about pressure tendencies, maybe telling us about temperature tendencies, maybe telling us how people are behaving during periods when it is really wet or it's really dry. And also using that same technology, our trusty cell phones with all of their power and our computer power in our pocket, to be able to get information out to people to keep them safe. And using better communication skills to get the weather story out to people. because it's not enough to get the information out. We have to get better at getting information back so that we know that the connection's been made, and we're not doing this where, we're sure that we've got the message out, like we told them, we told them the weather was going to be bad. And these folks saying, yeah, I heard something about it, but I didn't think that applied to me. Huh? And people can die when we don't make that connection. And so I think there's more opportunity for us in the future to be able to do better kind of instantaneous two-way communication so that people can get that information in, know what it means, and then take appropriate action to keep them and themselves and their families safe.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I've heard a lot of talk recently about better communication, but the two-way is so important, the giving it back to the meteorologist as well. Interesting. Great. Thank you so much. Do you have any new books coming out or a latest book you'd like to tell us about?
No, I don't at the moment. The first book was about weather forecasting, and the second one was about weather control. We're not any closer to controlling the weather. So, but I think there will be people who are still going to be wanting to try that. I mean, all you have to do is look at California and the huge amounts of water that are poured in there, and people thinking there must be a way to stop this. Quite frankly, I would say no. There's not a way to stop it, but it doesn't mean that people won't be thinking about it.